We all know the basic story, right? Colonists, tea, a harbor in Boston. But what if I told you the historical reality is so much richer and way more complicated than what we learned in elementary school? Today, we're going to peel back those myths. We're looking at massive corporate monopolies, global financial crises, and, believe it or not, the protection of local smuggling rings. It's the real story of the Boston Tea Party. So let's just dive right in with a question that might completely disrupt everything you thought you knew about that famous night in 1773. Was the Boston Tea Party actually a protest against higher taxes? Well, if you're like most people, you'd probably say, yeah, of course. But the truth? It's exactly the opposite. This whole protest, it wasn't about a price hike at all. It was actually about a price drop. Section 1. The Global Tea Trade, an 18th Century Crisis. Okay, to understand what really went down in Boston, we have to look across the Atlantic. At the absolute center of this story is the East India Company. They possessed a rock-solid legal monopoly on importing tea from China into Great Britain. Think of them as the ultimate too-big-to-fail mega-corporation of their day. They were just this massive commercial powerhouse. But by 1772, this absolute giant of global trade was literally teetering on the verge of total bankruptcy. So how does a mega corporation go broke? Well, it was a perfect storm of compounding disasters. First off, a devastating famine in Bengal between 1769 and 1773 drastically slashed their revenue from India. On top of that, they were bleeding, and I mean bleeding, about 400,000 pounds a year because consumers in Great Britain were just buying cheaper, smuggled Dutch tea instead. Because of all this, the East India Company ended up with a massive, growing mountain of surplus tea just sitting there, rotting in London warehouses. No one would buy it. They desperately needed cash, and they needed to offload this massive inventory fast. Section 2. The Tea Act of 1773, a corporate bailout. This brings us to the British Parliament's big solution. And the crucial takeaway here is that the Tea Act absolutely did not raise the price of tea for the colonists. Instead, Parliament essentially gave the East India Company a massive bailout. They allowed the company to completely bypass the usual London middlemen and export their tea directly to the American colonies. This slashed their overhead costs. Now, the British government did keep a small 3-pence townshend tax in place. But overall, the tea actually became cheaper. The whole point of the act was to aggressively undercut the colonial black market. This really hits the nail on the head. Just look at the math. Before the Tea Act, legal British tea was hovering around 3 shillings a pound. After the act, legally imported British tea dropped to a flat 2 shillings. Meanwhile, smuggled Dutch tea, the absolute staple of the black market, was sitting at 2 shillings and 1 penny. By making the legal, taxed British tea exactly 1 penny cheaper than the smuggled stuff, Parliament was threatening to put local smugglers and colonial merchants completely out of business overnight. So you see, the outrage sweeping across the colonies was never really about the cost of a cup of tea. It was about a really dangerous mix of corporate monopoly power and political control. Independent merchants, many of whom, let's be honest, were smugglers themselves, were staring down financial ruin. Plus, colonists were terrified that if the British government could just prop up a monopoly for tea, what was stopping them from doing it with any other good? And then there's that hidden 3-pence tax. It had a very specific and kind of insidious purpose. It was used to pay the salaries of colonial governors and judges. If Britain is writing their paychecks, those officials are suddenly accountable to London, not to the local colonists they're supposed to be serving. Section 3. The Boston Standoff. Tension in the harbor. While other colonies, like New York and Philly, successfully forced these tea ships to just turn right around and go home, Massachusetts Governor Thomas Hutchinson absolutely refused to yield. The tension in Boston Harbor was building by the day. In late November 1773, the tea ship Dartmouth arrives. Immediately, thousands of people cram into the Old South Meeting House, demanding the ship return to England. But here's the catch. Under British law, a ship had exactly 20 days to unload and pay its customs duties. If they didn't, officials could legally confiscate the cargo and forcibly bring it ashore. And that ticking clock was set to run out on December 16th. Okay, before we get to the night of the 16th, we have to do a quick bit of myth-busting. Legend has it that Samuel Adams stood up at that meeting and dramatically shouted, "This meeting can do nothing further to save the country," acting as this prearranged secret signal to kick off the riot. It makes for a fantastic movie scene, right? But actually, scratch that. Historical eyewitness accounts reveal he actually tried to stop people from leaving. He was desperately trying to maintain order because the meeting wasn't officially over yet. Section 4. Destruction of the tea. December 16, 1773. The crowd, however, had completely made up its mind. With that 20-day deadline expiring, protesters poured out into the streets and took matters into their own hands, heading straight for Griffin's Wharf, where 3 ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, were docked. Now, many of the Sons of Liberty who boarded the ships wore what were described as Mohawk warrior disguises. Let's be clear about this. They weren't genuinely trying to fool anyone into thinking an indigenous raiding party had just showed up. Instead, this was a deeply symbolic political choice. By dressing this way, they were boldly showing that they identified with America, actively rejecting their official status as obedient British subjects. When you look at the actual invoice data submitted to Parliament later by the East India Company, it gives you a granular sense of just how massive this operation was. Over the course of about 3 hours, dozens of men armed with axes methodically broke open 340 chests across those 3 ships. In total, they destroyed over 92,000 pounds of tea, just dumping the whole shebang directly into the freezing harbor water. And to put that into perspective, that is 1,276,141 pounds in modern British pounds. We are talking roughly 1.7 million US dollars of private corporate property that was utterly destroyed in a single night. Section 5. The Revolutionary Aftermath. The Point of No Return. As you can imagine, destroying nearly $2 million of a megacorporation's inventory provoked an absolute firestorm over in London. But over in the colonies, not everyone was horrified. In fact, in a diary entry written the very next day, John Adams immediately recognized that this brazen act of property destruction was the point of no return. He wrote about the majesty and sublimity of the act. He saw it as a true epocha in history, realizing that the people had finally done something so striking that it would change things forever. Back in Britain, Prime Minister Lord North felt the government had to risk absolutely everything to punish Boston. If they didn't, he figured all British authority in the colonies was totally finished. So Parliament passed a series of severe punitive measures that the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. They literally closed Boston's commerce and ended local self-government in Massachusetts. But here's where it totally backfired. Rather than isolating Boston, these harsh acts terrified the other 12 colonies. It united them in fierce outrage, leading directly to the First Continental Congress. The path to the Revolutionary War had officially been paved. The political fallout from this one night was so immense that it actually changed American daily culture forever. Practically overnight, drinking tea became viewed as a highly unpatriotic act. In this brilliant 1774 letter, John Adams tells his wife Abigail that he had to ask a local tavern keeper for coffee instead because she had entirely renounced tea. "I must be weaned," he wrote. So yeah, this single political protest literally helped spark the American nation's lasting, everyday love affair with coffee. Yet, there is a deep, fascinating historical irony to all of this. For decades after the Revolution, early American historians were actually kind of embarrassed by the whole event. I mean, it was a massive, lawless destruction of private property, which didn't exactly fit the neat, orderly narrative of the Founding Fathers. So for over 50 years, it was simply referred to as the destruction of the tea. Get this, the legendary, catchy phrase, Boston Tea Party, didn't even appear in print until 1834. So it wasn't just a simple revolt against paying an extra penny for a beverage, was it? Knowing that a massive corporate bailout, global supply chain issues, and the fierce protection of local smuggling profits actually helped ignite the American Revolution, well, how does that change your view of our founding history? It definitely makes you wonder what other elementary school myths might just need a second look. Thanks for digging into this with us.